Ties it, put it everywhere you want. All we ask is that you tag The Sean Ryan Show in the description. Thank you. Let's see what you got. All right, John, we're back from the break, and we're getting ready to dive into some NDEs are very hellish and kind of painting a picture of what hell looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, as I said before, in one study, and again, I told you, near-death experiencers are reticent to come forward because this is a sacred experience that is hard to describe in our three-dimensional terms. So they don't often come forward readily. But even of those who have come forward, 23%, according to one study, came forward talking about having a hellish experience to some degree or another. And so these are common. This 2019 European Academy of Neurology did a study across 35 countries, found that 5% of the population, or 1 out of 20, claims to have had a near-death experience. But they also found an even greater percentage that had hellish experiences or negative experiences. So you got to make sense of these as well. Interestingly, Jesus talked about hell a lot as something real, but not as a scare tactic. I think it's more as a look. This is reality, and what he came to do was that no one would go there. But some do in their near-death experience. So, for instance, I interviewed this atheist college professor, tenured college professor, who was he was an art professor who was doing a tour with students in Europe, in France, and his lower duodenum ruptured. You usually have like 5 to 6 hours before you're dead because you're spilling all that junk into your cavity. And it was a weekend, so they couldn't find a surgeon in France. And after 8 hours, he died. Now, he thought when you die, it's just unplug the computer, screen goes blank, there's nothing. And that's not what happened. And instead, he said he was standing there by his bed. He felt the worst he had ever felt in his life. And suddenly he feels wonderful. And he doesn't even know he's dead. Like he doesn't realize he's dead because he's sitting there thinking, something happened. I feel wonderful. And he feels these new senses. This group of people then come into the hallway. And he can see him in the hallway, and they're calling to him, Howard, come with us. And he said, I'm sick. I need a surgeon. That's what he's been waiting for. And they said, oh, we know all about you. Come with us. Don't you want us to help you? We're going to help you. Come on, we've been waiting a long time. Come with us. Okay, so time out. I like to point out that not every near-death experience is as deep as others, like meaning all the elements. So some there's an out-of-body experience and they're back in.
Okay.
Those can be interpreted in a million ways, right? A million worldviews can wrap around that. If Howard had at this point come back to his body and been resuscitated, his interpretation probably would have been, hey, it's all good. Atheists go to heaven. It feels great. It's nice people. Everything's good. But that's not what happened. So he starts to follow these people. And again, time and even distance, it doesn't work the same on the other side, which I don't fully understand that, except that by analogy, think about, from here to Austin, Texas, where I live, Nashville to Austin, it's a long way, right? It's a 2-hour flight. But what if I could think it and be there? How far is it now?
Yeah.
right? All of a sudden, distance doesn't mean the same thing. So on the other side, so he couldn't tell, and he follows these people, and he starts to realize they're deceiving him. They're starting to mock him. They're cursing him. They're all these, and he starts to realize this is not good. And then he realizes he's in this darkness, and it keeps getting darker, and he tries to say, hey, I want to go back. And they're like, you're not going anywhere. And they start pushing and shoving, and he's he calls it a darkness that's darker than black. And I've heard people commonly say that. Jesus called it the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, meaning like just, it's, I don't know, I guess just horrific. And that's what he experienced. And so he finally realizes he's being deceived by these creatures that he couldn't fully see completely, because they were kind of veiled. But now it's dark and he can't see them, but he can feel them, and they start to maul him. He starts to try to fight to get away, and they're having fun. So I've had him talk to me about this 4 times, and he starts to describe it. And then he says to me, I can't go any farther, because he had PTSD from it.
Every single time
And
you interviewed him, he couldn't push past.
yeah, he
certain
can't.
point.
There's a certain point that he would say, I can't go any farther because it's taken me a long time to. He had what vets would call PTSD, because it's real. It's more real than this. And I think that's a very important point to note, that what's ahead is better than the best we've experienced, but what's ahead is worse than the worst we've experienced too. And I believe that we are in a temporal, time capsule for a purpose. We are in a time of choosing. We're in a time of choosing. What kingdom do we want to be a part of? Is it me and my kingdom and I rule? Because as it turns out, that's what hell is. Hell is the creature wanting to play God. And it's dominate or be dominated. And that's what Howard realized in this place. It was really interesting, because he said, first of all, picture the worst prison scene. Like the worst. I years ago, I saw a movie, Midnight Express. You ever see that?
No, I haven't.
Turkish prison, just getting brutalized and raped daily, and all kinds of. It's a pretty gruesome movie. That's what was going on. And so, and just being eviscerated. And what he said, several things he said that was interesting. He said, I realized that these people were my kindred spirits. I said, what do you mean? So I realized that they were like me on earth. I came to a point in my life when I thought the biggest, baddest bear in the woods wins. And that's how I lived. And he said, I wasn't I wasn't nice to my students. I was all about me and building my monuments to myself and my ego. I cheated on my wife a lot. It was all about me. And he said, what I realized is that these people were like me on earth, but when the good was gone, it just spirals down worse and worse. So he's in this place, and this is really fascinating. He said in his solar plex, because he still was himself. And he said he heard, pray to God. And his first thought is, I don't believe in God. And he feels it again, pray to God. And he's like, he's fighting. And this is a very important thing, Sean, because the ego can imprison us. Our egos can absolutely imprison us. And he is literally in a hellish place, experiencing the worst things you can imagine. And he's hearing this pray to God, but he's fighting it. And finally, the third time, he's like, I don't even know what to pray. I don't, and and he starts just saying this like, God bless America and thy country 'tis of thee. And, he's just piecing things together and he's saying these things. But when he says the name of God, they become more angry and are threatening him even more. But he also noticed backing off. So he keeps doing it because it's working. And then he ends up just alone there. And he said, for how long, I don't know. He said, time doesn't work the same. It could have been decades. But he was just thinking about his life. And he was thinking about, how, again, on the other side, truth is truth. There's no hiding. And he's like, this is who I become. This is what I deserve. But at the same time, he didn't want that. And he hears in his soul the song he heard when someone took him to church as a kid, Jesus Loves Me. And he couldn't remember anymore except Jesus loves me. And he had this thought, and he now thinks God was even in that trying to reach him. In this battle he's having in his own spirit, even then. And he finally gets to the end of himself. We all have to hit rock bottom before we look up. That's a famous recovery principle. Some different people have different rock bottoms, but many times we have to hit rock bottom before we look up. And Howard said to me, my rock bottom was low. And he cries out, he thinks to himself, even if Jesus does exist, why would he care about me? I've been so horrible. But in desperation, he just cried out, Jesus, save me. And he said, into this darkness, he sees a speck of light coming, getting brighter and brighter and brighter, till again, he described as brighter than the sun, but he could look at it, and it was mesmerizing, and arms reach out, pick him up, take him out of there. And he's then standing before these angels being held by Jesus, and he gives them a life review. Now, I want to fast forward for a second because the story sounds so like, you got to be making this up. But after this near-death experience, this Howard, this atheist, tenured college professor, once you have tenure, you don't leave that. Mm-hmm. You can't be fired. It's the most secure thing you could have. 2 years after his near-death experience, he leaves his tenured college professorship to become a Christian pastor. His wife divorces him because she's still an atheist and thinks he's crazy. How do you explain that?
Yeah.
And what he would say, Jesus. In the presence of Jesus, he's getting this life review. And he said some very interesting things. So he had a very abusive father. And like beat him daily. Cursed him out daily. Nothing was ever good enough. And he said, I was seeing these scenes of my life play out, and I was seeing that my father was a horrible person. But I was also seeing that it was a two-way street, that I resented him and I did things to provoke him and to rebel against him. And he said the places where I always thought, well, I'm the victim, I'm the good guy, and everybody else is the bad guy. He said, no, I realized that God wants us to take responsibility for ourselves. He'll take responsibility of what's right and wrong and who's where and what. All we can do is take responsibility for ourselves. And so he, when he came back, he reconciled with his father. And his brothers and sisters disowned him for a while because they were like, how in the world can you reach out to him and become friends with him? He was horrible. And yet that's what God does. He restores what evil has torn apart and broke, and was broken. And so Howard Howard has seen all this played out. And another funny thing in his life review is he comes to this one point, and again, what I love is that, Howard is, he's funny, but he's also crass. And he's just himself with Jesus. Like, he feels so comfortable just to be himself because he said, I'm here with who I realize is my Lord and Savior and friend and creator. And he said, the most loving, wonderful being I've ever imagined being with. And in his life review, he's seen these scenes of him using and abusing other people. And he said it was like I could feel how it was hurting him, like I was stabbing him with a knife. He said, not literally, but it felt that way.
He was feeling the pain that he inflicted on others. Is that what you're saying?
He was feeling the pain it caused Jesus when he was inflicting pain on others. And then conversely, he showed him as well a time, really simple thing, when I think his sister had lost a pet and was grieving. And he heard her crying in the middle of the night. And he got up and he went in there and he just hugged her. And he said, I was overwhelmed because it caused God so much joy that I would do that simple thing. Which is wild if you think about it.
It is.
But that's what Jesus said to Paul when he appears as this brilliant God of light on the Damascus road, and Paul was persecuting believers in Jesus. And he said, who are you? Paul said, who are you, Lord? And Jesus said, I'm Jesus who you're persecuting. But he wasn't persecuting Jesus. He's persecuting people. But that's that oneness, right? That we come from God, and God has a connection to us. He is, Paul said, in him we live and move and have our being. Acts chapter 17. In other words, he is the life force that keeps us going. He's always been with you. Through the highs and lows, there's no one who gets you more, because there's no one else who's been through everything with you, understands the whys and the hows, and it's amazing.
Yeah. How many accounts of hellish NDEs do you think you've had?
A lot. I mean,
half, quarter.
I haven't counted. Interestingly, like some of the ones that are now my friends are now pastors.
Really?
It's fascinating.
Were all of them atheists?
No, like Paul Ojeda, it's a good friend of mine. He was a cocaine addict. He and his wife was a stripper. She wasn't his wife. They just lived together. They were a part of they were in and out of cartels. I mean, it was, and he has a cocaine overdose, and suddenly he's dropping. He said, I was sober and I was dropping through this blacker than black. He described it the same way. And he was like, what is happening? Like, I'm not high. And he knew, I'm going to hell. And he was like, oh my gosh, I can't go to hell. I'm a good person. I didn't do anything wrong. Like, I've never murdered, and he's justifying. I've never murdered anybody. I haven't been mean to anybody, and he said the more he justified, the faster he felt himself dropping. Until finally he said, he got to his end and he just cried out, God save me. God help me. You got to help me. And he didn't stop dropping. He didn't stop falling. He felt God's presence there right with him. He didn't see anything visual, but he knew. And he hears a voice direct to his soul, Paul, what have you done with the life I've given you? And then boom, he re-sees his life, like the whole thing, the whole life review. And at the end of it, his conclusion was, I deserve this. And he says, God, I want people to know. I want people to know. And he's back in the hospital. And he comes to and says to Lillian, who's now his wife, I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm going to find the God that just saved me. Because, and he ends up then coming to faith in Jesus and starting a church in Austin accidentally, because he just kept telling people about his experience, who had been in a lot of people in, addicted, drugs, Wiccan, a lot of stuff, a lot of suicidal ideations and all that. And they would call him and he would explain what happened to him, and they would open their lives to Jesus, and they would find peace. And they started going like, you got to move here. He was living on a golf course in Houston. He's a master plumber, living on a golf course in Houston. He sells his house on the golf course and moves to Austin and just starts helping these people. And now he has one of the largest Hispanic churches in Austin.
Wow. What are some, do you have any more accounts where there maybe are demons that are encountered?
Yeah. I'll tell you, Sean, I mean, studying these has actually changed my theology in this sense. Even as a Christian and even as a pastor, I used to think a lot of it was, just fantastical, metaphorical, but hearing enough of these people saying the things they say, what I've come to is that on the good side, all of our, in some ways, wildest dreams and fantasies and fiction and, the things we only dream of that might be possible, that's better than that. And the horror that we can imagine and see and come up with, it's worse than that. And that both are based in a reality that's beyond this life.
Yeah.
So this one guy that I interviewed for the new book for Imagine the God of Heaven, he's in there. His name is Jim Woodford. And he was a commercial airline pilot, agnostic. He grew up Catholic, but then kind of just, it didn't mean anything to him ever. He said, never prayed a day in his life. His wife was a Christian and was praying for him. He was also a very wealthy businessman. So he'd started multi-million-dollar businesses, he's a Canadian, he had a horse farm, had 19 British sports cars in a garage, a yacht, his own airplane. But he got Guillain-Barré disease, which is very painful. Got addicted to opioids. And one night he was out checking the fence lines of his property, feeling the pain coming on. He's facing the setting sun, and he went and took the rest of the bottle. And he forgot that he had already taken more that day. And he said to me, when you're dying. He said, I felt it coming up, like this fire coming up through me. And he said, I knew it. And he had this realization that I've never thanked God for the life I thought was my own making. It's like, boom, he just has that realization. Which I have heard enough of these to realize that, you don't want to wait till the last minute, but God is pursuing people to the last minute. He is. And in that last minute, as his head is about to hit the steering wheel, he cries out, God, forgive me. And then he dies. And Jim is actually a jokester, so I like to joke with him. I think you beat the thief on the cross for last minute. Yeah, and he did. And he says, that's who I identify. You know who I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Because there were two thieves on the cross. They're probably murderers. And one of them mocked Jesus, and the other realized that he was probably the Messiah that was foretold. And he said, Jesus, when you come in your kingdom, remember me. That was it. Jesus said nothing to the guy mocking him and demanding that he get them all down off the cross if he's really God, which is fascinating. You know, we say, prove yourself to me, God. He's like, I don't need to. But the humble guy who realizes we deserve this, he doesn't. Will you remember me? And Jesus said to him, you'll be with me in paradise today. It's a great thing to remember.
Yeah.
There's nothing we can do to keep ourselves from God and his love except say, I don't need you. I'm good.
What are some of the commonalities that you see when it comes to hell experiences?
Well, let me finish telling you about Jim. So Jim then is going up, and he is going through this tunnel he calls it a tunnel of light. And then he comes out, and he interestingly had I wouldn't say this is common, but I've seen more common like this where they both get a heavenly and a hellish experience. And I find that those who they cry out to God for forgiveness last minute, it's almost like he lets them see where they were headed before rescuing them. I don't know if that's what's really going on, or maybe he's just saying, I know you're going back and I want you to see the reality of both. I don't know. But Jim, then he sees this beauty like on the right, but then it's almost, he said there was almost like a line of delineation, and then it got more and more gray and black, and then almost like a black charcoal crevasse that just dropped off into nothingness. And I don't know why, but out of curiosity, he starts to go over there to see what it is. And it's like, he said, imagine looking down into the darkest black valley you can imagine, but darker than that. And then he saw a tiny pinpoint of light, almost like a campfire in the distance. And he hears something open up, and he sees this, what he called a creature, come out of it. And it's in the book, but basically that creature comes for him and knows his name. And he realizes that, it wanted to claim him, which I know. I mean, honestly, if I were listening to this as my skeptical self, I'd be like, oh, this is make-believe. And when Jim told it to me, that's what I was thinking. And if I hadn't heard enough of them, if I hadn't heard enough of them, but I have, that I think there's a reality to it.
Who do you think the demons are? These creatures?
I think they are created by God. I think they were angels. And that is what the Bible tells us, that God created another species called the angelic species. Just like, we're a species, and dogs are a species, and cats are a species, there are angels. And they're even either subspecies or other species within that. There are seraphim, there are cherubim. They don't look like, humans with wings. They look otherworldly. And I've had near-death experiencers describe them to me. I know.
What do they look like?
Creatures with eyes all over them.
How do they describe them?
I mean, Ezekiel in the Bible describes the same things that I've heard near-death experiencers describe. So there are life forms, and there are creatures beyond just what we know and see and imagine.
Well, I'd love to hear some descriptions of what these look like.
Well, okay, so interestingly, seraphim looks somewhat like a serpent, but with wings and not exactly like we would think. And according to the Jewish prophets, like Ezekiel, who claims that they saw these creatures around God's throne, they inhabit that place. Now it's fascinating because Satan, who we call Satan, which just means accuser, that's what Satan means. So a Satan is an accuser. Lucifer is who we mean, and Lucifer means light bearer. But he was a cherubim. He was one of these creatures around God's throne guarding the most, what near-death experiencers have told me who have seen that or been there is it is the most powerful place in the universe. It's also the most splendid, spectacular, energized. Like it's where everyone would want to be. But also it's solid and physical, but crystal clear at the same time, which I don't know what that means,
Yeah.
But that's what they say. But interestingly, that's what John describes in the book of Revelation. That's what Ezekiel, a Jewish prophet, describes. So there are species that God created beyond humanity that are not bound by time and space like we are, that exist in dimensionalities beyond ours. I believe all that. I think the Bible teaches that. I think near-death experiencers confirm that. And not all of them follow God or God's will. So, as the biblical story goes, Lucifer rebels and decides he wants to raise himself above the Most High, above God. My will be done. And other angels and creatures that God created followed him. And in eternity, this gets into why I think, that age-old question, why would God, if God is all loving and God is all powerful, why in the world would he allow us to suffer like we do on this earth, right? It's an age-old question. And the one many atheists level at God, like that just proves there is no God. Which interestingly, it can be turned back around, because if there is no God, why are we bothered by suffering? It just is. It always has been. Why should it bother us? We evolved this way. But in fact, the reason we unanimously are opposed to it is that there's something in us that tells us something's not right. But not right according to who, right?
Yeah.
So it actually turns, I think, into an argument for God. But I think the answer to that question is that there are creatures created by God that rebelled against God in eternity, which decisions that aren't made in a sequence of time, when we make a decision in a sequence of time, we can change because it's not an eternal decision. Mm-hmm. So we get to choose, and we can correct our mistakes in our temporal world. But angels who chose my will, not God's will, there's only one place where God stays out. And Jesus said he created hell for the angels, not for humans. So hell is the place where the love and the light and the life and the rulership of God, the will of God being done, does not happen. God says, okay, to the free will creature, have it your way. And so hell is angels becoming demons and people, devolving into our worst selves, tyrannizing one another, fight to dominate or be dominated.
What are some of the commonalities that you see on
Hellish experiences.
yes?
In Imagine Heaven, in the chapter I do on hell, I kind of saw 3 or 4, I don't know if you call it levels, but different descriptions. So one is, and I don't know if it's hell per se, but it's like a void. So some experience just this void. They go into a void, and it's just kind of like a void of nothingness. Another is what I called hell on earth. So this one, he was actually stationed at Camp Barkley in Texas before World War II. Dr. George Ritchie. In fact, he was the very first one to start talking about his near-death experience, which then led to Moody, the first one who researched it, which is the book I read decades ago.
Wow.
But he heard George Ritchie lecture at the University of Virginia, Moody did, and then started asking his students in his philosophy class if they had ever had any encounter with death, and he hears more and more of those stories and wrote them down. And that's what I read the first time.
Okay.
But George Ritchie has this experience where he dies of like a intense double pneumonia before he was being deployed he was going to medical school, but through the Army. And he leaves his body, same kind of thing, and he's confused because he doesn't understand where he is because he still feels alive. And he's trying to find, he's supposed to be on the train to get to medical school. And so he starts looking, he starts traveling and going, and again, I don't understand how, you kind of go like, what do you mean you don't know you're dead? You're flying across the earth. I don't know, but this is what he said. He realizes he's traveling and he's going across, and it's our earth, and he's trying to get to medical school, and he ends up coming to this place, and I think it was like right across the Mississippi River. So again, he was in Camp Barkley in Texas. He ends up at this bar across this river in this city he'd never been to, and he sees someone standing outside this bar with Pabst Blue Ribbon sign, and he stops there and he's trying to get his attention because he's trying to figure out, where am I and how do I get to med school? Okay, and he keeps trying to tap the guy on the shoulder, and there's nothing. Like, he goes right through him. And so he starts to realize, what am I? Where am I? Am I dead? And long story short, he makes his way back. This is actually in Imagine Heaven, but he makes his way back to his room and sees his body, and then realizes, I am dead. And at that moment, this light comes into the room, same as usual, brighter than the sun. But he sees it's not a light, it's a man made of light. And he had the thought instantly, I'm standing before the Son of God. And again, he gets a life review, and he knows this is Jesus, and Jesus takes him and shows him first these people on earth who are, and this is why I called it hell on earth, is that they are bound to the things they worshiped or idolized on earth. So one guy he sees is in a bar desperately trying to steal a drink from somebody. So he's still enslaved, but he's incorporeal, so he can't fulfill the need. And he sees that. He sees a woman following her son, just nagging him still. And so he gets this understanding, like, you know, that when God is not God, you know, what Jesus said is love God first, love your neighbor as yourself. That sums up the whole Bible, he said, right? But when we put other things as God, you know, what he was kind of seeing is that's a form of hell. We continue on from this life and still trying to get it or that person or that thing to fulfill what only God can fulfill. And so he sees that. That's another kind of level of hell that I talk about. Another one is this outer darkness, which I already described, that Howard Storm, the tenured professor, went through. Interestingly, others have described the same thing. Dr. Rajiv Parti was chief anesthesiologist at the Bakersfield Heart Hospital. He didn't, you know, he was an anesthesiologist, so he had brought many people back claiming to have near-death experiences and all the things we've talked about, and he'd give them a shot of antipsychotic drug and go check the stock market because he thought they're delusional. He didn't believe it. Mm-hmm. And then he had one.
He had one.
And he ended up in the LA hospital, ruptured septic, the whole thing. He codes. He finds himself initially in a hellish place, and very similar to Howard. And he described, I mean, this is an anesthesiologist who's Hindu, who grew up in India, and he's got a lot to lose. And he's describing hell as this place of both darkness and fire and these evil creatures that are running around torturing him and others.
How descriptive did he get with the torturing?
Descriptive.
What, like what?
You know, and I don't even like to describe it because it just doesn't sound real. You know, but like stuff we would do to torture each other, you know, like bed of nails kind of stuff, and cutting open but in ways to prolong the pain and the agony. So here's the other weird thing, Sean, that I don't know that I fully understand, is that it seems like on the other side, we do still have a body, we still are ourselves, we can still feel stuff, and in fact, we feel it exponentially more, the good and the bad. And a lot of the evil things we see on earth is it's just when evil can use us to get its will done to each other. But there's God's Spirit constraining, and there's law, which is from God as well, constraining evil here. What happens when you take that away? And evil's not constrained, and it just devolves. So yeah, I mean, they describe stuff like that. And that, you know, that is why I believe God allows the suffering we're going through now. We say, how could God allow so much suffering? What if instead it's God's merciful warning for a short period of time, truncated immensely? In other words, we've been squeezed down in our experience of good so that we can only experience a small amount of how evil things can get. So this life is a taste of heaven and a taste of hell, very reduced, so that we choose, so that we see that God's will is good. And he did what he did through Jesus to forgive us all. So the only thing that can keep us separated from God is ourselves. You know, C.S. Lewis, he was an Oxford scholar, he's one of my favorite authors. once said, the gates of hell are locked from the inside. I think he's right. I think after interviewing so many near-death experiencers, and some have even said it, it's like, it's not God's will that anyone would go to hell. But if they don't want God, like if you're a Hitler, or Stalin, or, Taliban or whatever, and you want to be God, you want to determine who lives, who dies, who does my will, what's God supposed to do? Take someone into heaven and make them obey against their will? Well, that would be hell for them. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in fact, I think God allows the suffering, but in the midst of the good, and he's always with us through it, and he's also always trying to get us to just turn to him so that he can lead and guide us not only through it, but out of it, and to undo evil with good.
What about commonalities between the people that have hellish experiences? Have you noticed anything in common with the folks that have those type of experiences versus having a more blissful?
Well, here's one of the both hopeful and also interesting is that most of the hellish experiences I've talked to have at some point, they cried out to God for forgiveness and he rescued them. So this Rajiv Parti, like I said, Hindu anesthesiologist, he does from that, he cries out to God and he said, he used the word repenting. I was realizing my wrongs. He'd been verbally abusive toward his son. He had become addicted to painkillers. He was just all about materialism. He also got a life review and saw how he treated his patients poorly. They were just an object to make more money. He sees all this. And then he said, these two angels take him through this tunnel out of this hellish experience to this place of exquisite beauty, mountains and rivers and forests and all this, and into the presence of this God of light who knows him, who is love. And later, he encounters the same God of light and says to him, just like Paul on the Damascus Road, "Who are you, Lord?" Because he realizes this is not one of the gods I learned of in Hinduism. He's merciful, he's loving, he's compassionate. I thought he was going to send me back to hell. I deserved it, but he didn't. And he sends me back and he says, "You still have a purpose, and I want you to learn, and I want you to love." And so he sees this God of light again, and he says, "Who are you, Lord?" And he says, out of the light steps a man in a robe with a beard, gold sash, and says to him, "I'm Jesus, your Savior."
Wow.
So you got a Rwandan imam, you got an anesthesiologist who is Hindu, I have a manufacturing engineer I haven't told you about fully, who grew up in India as well, describes the holy city of God.
The cartel couple.
And here's the point. God is good even to those who don't deserve it, and none of us deserve it.
Do you think there are different levels of hell?
I do. Because they've told me those that near-death experiencers who had a taste said, some, like Howard said, they even told him that. Like, this is nothing. Wait till you see where we're going to take you.
How many levels?
I don't know. Let me say different places, different. What I would say is the world to come is vast. So there are vast amounts of good places in the world to come.
Are there levels to heaven?
Yeah, which will throw some people, but in this sense, like, so the center of the holy city of God is the throne of God. Now, and I talk about this in Imagine the God of Heaven, that even talking about the throne of God and God the Father on his throne and this spectacular thing, God is more than that. So God incarnated in the person of Jesus as a representation of God in human form. I personally believe that there in the heavenly city, where when we're not bound by our three dimensions, but we're our spiritual bodily selves in a new realm, that God the Father manifests in a way that the residents of heaven can see God. But the Bible tells us that God is spirit, and that he is both everywhere simultaneously and beyond everything he's created. He's in everything and sustaining everything. There's nowhere he's not at any point in time. But he's not just the sum of all of his creation. He transcends. He's beyond all of his creation. And what's wild is hearing near-death experiencers who had no theological understanding, no biblical understanding, and they're describing the same thing.
A lot of people are talking as if we're now in end times. I'm just curious if you see any symbology or if you think that we're approaching end times.
You know, I don't typically go there. And the reason I don't is because Jesus said no one knows the day or the time. So I don't know. But I'll tell you what I do know that I find fascinating. One thing is, as evil seems to be increasing, I believe God is giving increasing testimony of his reality and goodness. And I think these near-death experiences all over the world are that. I think he is saying in this day of global internet connectedness, look, I'm the God of all people. I love all people equally. It doesn't matter where they live or their background or what they've been through. And what he did through Jesus, he did for all people, for all time. So I think he's doing that. Now, having said that, there's something that happened in 1948 that was a precursor to the end, whenever the end is. And it also was one of the things that most convinced me that God is real back 30 plus years ago, when I was still, like trying to really think all this through and understand, is there evidence for it? So in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah wrote, like I said, in 780 BC, 780 years before Jesus. In Isaiah chapter 11, God says to him, in the last days, I will put a sign before all the nations. Again, he's speaking to all the nations. People don't realize that about the Bible. He's always thinking about everyone. And he says, I will regather the scattered people of Judah, the Jewish people, from the four quarters of the earth, so north, south, east, and west, and reestablish them in their land again, and they will never be displaced again. So he says that in Isaiah chapter 11. And the second time he was going to regather them. The first time was in 586 BC, when they were scattered to the Babylonian. They were conquered by the Babylonians. They were displaced from their land. Then they came back. They rebuilt the temple. They rebuilt Jerusalem. All that. In 30 AD, Jesus is crucified. And the week before that, he comes in on the donkey and he is looking out over Jerusalem, and it says he weeps over the city. And he says, if you had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now your enemies are going to come on you and scatter you to the nations because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. So he says that. So Jesus is crucified in 30 AD. This is all history. Like, historians would not doubt this. 70 AD, 40 years later. Okay, so 40 years was the time of the Israelites wandering in the desert when they rebelled against God. I believe from crucifying Jesus, 40 years, I think God was giving to see their mistake. But 70 AD, Roman General Titus marches on Jerusalem, levels the city, levels the temple. Temple still hasn't been rebuilt to this day, but the Jewish people were scattered. And and Jesus had said that was going to happen. Isaiah the prophet, 700 years had said that's going to happen as a sign to all the nations. From 70 AD to 1948, 1900 years, the Jewish people didn't have a land, they didn't have a king or a president, they didn't have a common language. I mean, when has there ever been a people scattered for 1900 years with none of that remained a people? How could they? And yet, in Isaiah chapter 66, again written before Jesus, God says through Isaiah, can a nation be born overnight? Of course, the answer is no. It's never happened. He said, yet no sooner is Zion, and Zion's the mountain on which Jerusalem is, established, in labor than she gives birth to her children. And he says, I will bring Jerusalem back and celebrate with Jerusalem. In 1948, okay, after the Holocaust, I mean, imagine the birth pangs of this birth that's to come. Evil's trying to wipe out the Jewish people. And I believe because this is a major sign to all the nations. It's God's sign that he cares for all nations. That's what he said it was. Jewish people from, Russian Jews, German Jews, Ethiopian Jews, Australian Jews, American Jews, from all over come back and start to resettle Israel. And in 1948, the UN declared Israel a nation overnight. I have the article in the New York Times.
Wow.
But God said it, 2,700 years ago. Jesus said it. And then it happened. And he said it would be a sign to all the nations. So that had to happen before the end. Jesus then also said in Matthew chapter 24, he was talking about all the things that are going to happen in the end times. And he said something that was interesting. He said, when you see the fig tree start to blossom, you know it's spring. Even so, you know summer is near. In the same way, when these things start to happen, this generation will not pass away until all of it is accomplished. Okay, so I always thought, well, wait a second, that's not true. Like the generation he was talking to there did pass away, and it wasn't all accomplished. But maybe what he meant is the fig tree was always a symbol of Israel. And so when the fig tree starts to blossom, you know summer's near. When the leaves come out again, when it's brought back to life. So does that mean when Israel was brought back to life in 1948, one generation? And then the question is, what's a generation? Is a generation 70 years, or is it everyone who was alive in 1948 and might be 100 years old, so it might be 2058? I don't know. And I don't speculate. What I say to people who are like all worried and fearful that it's going to be the end, I say, you're right. It's going to happen in your lifetime. it's going to end in your lifetime. Because we're all going to die.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how, but we don't need to worry about that. It's like live for what matters, and there's nothing to fear.
When these folks that have the hellish NDE experience, do all of them, do the majority of them, do they convert?
I mean, a lot do. Not all do. I don't know. Actually, do I know anyone who's had a hellish experience? I think if they don't talk about it. They bury it and run from it. Because I can't think of anyone who hasn't. But maybe they just don't talk about it. I don't know.
Interesting. I would think they would. They would. But it sounds like everybody that you brought up had.
Yeah, I mean,
kind of converted.
Well, and convert. I guess. What do you mean by that?
I mean, are they a believer now?
Yeah, I mean, just about all the people I've talked about are followers of Jesus. So they came back seeking, and they discovered.
Let's talk. We have a couple of random topics to bring up that
right.
You thought would be a good idea. So I'm just going to bring them up. Let's talk about the Hindu man that describes the city of God.
Oh, well, and this is in the category of why I wrote Imagine the God of Heaven. Like I said before, I really believe that God is raising up these testimonies all over the globe that he is the God of all nations. From Genesis 12, like we talked about, where he said he's going to raise up the Abraham and Sarah to bless all nations. Jesus comes. He says he took the bullet, because we are all meant to be his children. And so like a good parent, he went in front of the line of fire of what is required for justice. And he took the bullet for us so we don't have to. And then he said, tell all the nations there's forgiveness offered in my name. So again, all the nations. Revelation chapter 7, John is seeing heaven, and he said, there around the throne of God are people from every nation and tribe and language and people group. So God's going to do it, like somehow, some way. And I think that's part of what these near-death experiences in our age of global communication, when I couldn't have written this book 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Because I interviewed this Rwandan imam and Australian and, guy in Singapore and, all these people all over the world that I could interview by Zoom, and their story can be heard, but that couldn't have happened even 5 years ago. And so that's what I think he's doing. So Santosh became a good friend of mine, dear man. He grew up in India and Hindu background. His father was a Sanskrit scholar, so he knew the Hindu scriptures really well. He has his gallbladder erupted into his pancreas and caused his blood pressure to shoot up over 200, or his heartbeat was like 200 beats per minute, and they couldn't get it down. They couldn't operate, and he coded. And he hears code blue, and then he's above his body, and this brilliant God of light, he knew was a divine light, he said. And he said to me in the interview, he said, I always thought when you die, it's either nothing or maybe I would come back as another life form. He said, but that didn't happen. Instead, this divine light comes to him, and he said, I fell in love with this light because I knew it was good and there to protect me and cared about me. And he follows and he travels through, again, these tunnels that he He said they went through. And he comes to this place and he's parked up on a platform overlooking what he described it to me as a giant compound. Now, I've been to India many times. We helped build a hospital in India. And India, if you've ever been, have you ever been? You know, they're compounds. They're high-walled, gated communities everywhere, at least where I've been. And he described it that way, but he said, on the other side, your eyesight is like telescopic. So I could see like thousands of miles each side, and it was square-shaped and thousands of miles. And inside just these lush, gorgeous, just spectacular beauty and grounds of nature, but also these buildings of otherworldly building material. And he's a manufacturing engineer. So that's what he would notice. Otherworldly building material, these spectacular, beautiful buildings. And he saw people, and he said, I long to go in there. He said, I realized this is the place we all would love to be. That's what he said. And he saw 12 gates. He said, I counted them. I could see them all, 12 gates all the way around. And he said they were closed to me. And he looks at the nearest to try to find a way in, and he sees angels outside the gates. And he said, then I realize I'm looking at the kingdom of heaven. All right, now what he described is to the T what John describes in Revelation chapter 21, when he says he was taken in his spirit up to a very high mountain that others have described as these mountains taller than the Himalayas overlooking the city. And interestingly, John says he describes the city, and somehow he reads the names on the foundation stones. How? Unless he's saying he too had telescopic vision. And this is in the Bible, right? John describes a walled, gated city, square-shaped, and 12 gates and angels outside the gates, exactly as Santosh described. Santosh had never read the Bible. All he knew was Hinduism. And then, interestingly, he's like, where am I? And he's looking around and he realizes he's up on a high platform, very high, and there's no railing. And he looks down to his left and he says it was hell. He said he was looking into what I think was a vision of hell. I don't think hell is right outside the city of God. And again, I think that's where time and distance and space, they work differently. But God showed him that. He said it was an abyss. He said it was a dark, hopeless abyss that he said had a lake of fire at the bottom, which even as a pastor, I thought that was metaphor. Because I was like, you can't have utter darkness and a lake of fire. The fire lights up the darkness. Mm-hmm. I don't get it.
Not there, huh?
I don't get it, but they said it. And this is a Hindu guy.
Yeah.
This is not someone trying to prove the Bible. So there's a lot of this that changed me to kind of go, well, maybe it's not all metaphor like I thought, or as much metaphor as I thought. So then Santosh is like, he doesn't want to go there. He wants to go in the city, and he's looking for another way in, and he turns and looks, and there he said he sees a throne, and who he said he knew this was the Almighty. So this is God, and he knew the brilliant light was God, but in this case, he was in the form of a man, but giant. Which again, I would have said like, what? But I heard so many say this. So I don't know what to do with it.
This is all of these. Wow. So
I know.
all the descriptions are very similar.
Very similar. They overlap. All the ones I'm telling you have others who say the same things. Otherwise, I kind of just put them on a shelf.
Yeah.
Until I hear multiple ones reporting the same things, I kind of put it on a shelf and like, yeah, maybe.
Do you have this all mapped out somewhere? I'm just
I
curious.
wrote 2 books.
I mean, yeah, but 1,500-ish.
Oh yeah, I have
Interviews,
so many documents. It's just, Word documents of interviews and Zoom interviews recorded and audio interviews recorded. And
How were you able to map them all into the
all
commonalities?
the different commonalities?
Yeah.
It took 35 years. I mean, I'm not kidding. It's like I didn't just set out to do this. I'm just obsessively curious, and I don't know why. I do know why. I now know why. I think this is God's mission for me. And, there were a lot of things along the way that I'd ask, like, why did I do that? Why did I become an engineer if you wanted me to start a church for skeptics, but all of it had a reason now. I see that. My engineer brain trained me, like, when things don't make sense, just hold on to them, keep at it until the puzzle pieces start to fit. And that's what he's used in this research too. So real quick with Santosh, what was amazing is in the presence of the Almighty, he sees this. He told me later he believes this was the glorified Jesus on his throne, because what he described is what John described in Revelation chapter 1. It's what Daniel described in Daniel chapter 7. This man of light, feet glowing bronze, and like face like the sun, eyes like lightning. He doesn't always appear like that. Mm-hmm. He doesn't. But he did to Santosh. He did to Bibi in Tehran. So it appears differently at times to different people. But Santosh thinks he's gonna cast him into hell because he has a life review and he sees all his sins and he knows, that's what I deserve. And when God speaks to him, he said, I felt such tenderness and mercy and compassion and love. He said, Santosh, I'm sending you back to earth. And when you go back, you must love your family and especially your daughter. She needs your help right now, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, this is supposedly the Christian God. Here's a Hindu man, but he knows intimately what his daughter's going through and how his daughter needs her father. Isn't that amazing? And he comes back and well, first of all, when he feels this compassion and tenderness and forgiveness from the Lord, he gets bold and he sees right next to the throne, he said, he called it this very narrow gate or door that was open to him. It was the only one that was open into what he called the kingdom of heaven. And he said, Lord, when I come back, how do I go through that door? I want to go through that door into your kingdom. How do I do it? Which is interesting because God does not often give instruction or direction. And again, I think it's because he wants to know, will we seek him? And he says, if you seek me with all your heart, you'll find me. But he did say this to Santosh because Santosh was thinking, what church do I go to? What mosque? What temple? I'll go anywhere. And he was thinking religion, like once a week religion. That's what he was thinking in his mind. And the Lord said, no, I want relationship. I want to know how honest, how sincere will you be with me? Not one day a week, 365 days a year. How sincere and honest will you be with me? And then he said to him, the wages of sin is death, which is a Bible verse, And the next part of it is, but the free gift of God is forgiveness through Jesus. But he didn't tell him that part, which is interesting. He waited for him to come back and seek. And then he said to him, surrender yourself to me daily and walk with me. And Santosh told me, I was actually confused when I came back because I was like, I know the gods of the Hindu scriptures, and this God of of light and love, this mighty, almighty giant, you know. He said he was compassionate and tender, and he knew all my wrongs. I knew what I deserved, and yet he forgave me. He was compassionate. Who was this? And he's seeking him. He's praying every day. I want to know you. I want to know you. 2 years later, his daughter is invited to sing. She was a choral major in college. She's invited to sing in a choir at a church with her friend. Santosh goes to hear her. And when he walked in, he felt the same loving presence of that God of light. And the message that day is on the narrow gate and how Jesus is the gate through which you enter into the kingdom of heaven. And he told me, he said, I was like, this is just for me. And he goes home and he starts reading the Bible, and he said, everything I experienced was in this book.
Wow.
And he became a very devoted follower of Jesus. Now, Santosh passed away last month. Yeah, it's been pretty cool, because what he wanted more than anything, he loved his family so much, and he knew that's what God wanted him to do, was to love his family. And so I've been able to be a little bit in contact with them, and it's really cool to see them even opening up to what he was saying.
Yeah, I'll bet that's
because again, you know, it's like
really neat.
he went. It's, you know, people get caught up in like, well, you're saying your religion is the right religion. No. You know, Muslims don't perfectly keep the 5 pillars of Islam. Buddhists don't perfectly keep the 8-fold path of Buddhism. Christians and Jews don't perfectly keep the 10 commandments. Atheists don't perfectly keep their own moral code. They too hurt people and do things that they later regret and have to apologize for. You know, none of us are perfect. And what God wants people to know is that he is a God who is willing to forgive all, so that we'll walk with him, just like he told Santosh.
Man, you know, I was going to go further, but that seems like the perfect way to end this. But, so John, if there's nothing else that you'd like to discuss, I say we cut it right there.
Sounds good.
Well, man, I just want to say thank you for coming on and sharing your experiences and with interviewing these people and your take on a multitude of different subjects that I threw at you. I'm sure some of them were a surprise, but actually there is one last question, and that is, why did you write Imagine the God of Heaven? What was the goal behind that one?
You know, Sean, it was because I want people to see how God gets you, and he's crazy about you, like crazy about you, which sounds weird. But what I've realized is that each one of us is unique to him. You know, people will say to me, there are billions of people. How could he care about me? I have that same thought when I go through airports. I look at all these people, you know, and they're like, it's just a crowd to me, right? And yet, what NDEers have told me is that when they were with him consistently, they say, I felt like I was the only one he loved. One Jim Woodford said, I thought about others, and then I realized, oh, he loves them like they're the only ones. And that's because, and another one, Dean Braxton, told me that what he realized experiencing that is that God has a unique love that's only for you, because no one else he created is like you. And I want skeptics to know, like when I was a skeptic, there's a ton of evidence. This is not blind faith. You know, there's a ton of evidence that this is real and this is true, so that they will put their trust in God. You know, faith, Why does God care about faith? Because faith is just trust, and you can't have a relationship without trust. And relationship is what God wants. And so then, for others to see how the heart and the character of God is good and accessible, that even though it's mysterious, and I'll admit, how do you hear the voice of God? How do you walk with a God you can't see and can't hear? And I go into that because just like communication on the other side is thought to thought, that's how God speaks to us, to our thoughts. And you have to start to learn to discern. And as you act on those, you look back and you see, like in an amazing way, like, oh my gosh, okay, like he is with me. And when I'm willing to listen and do what I think he's saying, he shows me. And so I wrote it for that reason, because I want people to see that God is the God of all nations. He doesn't like one group of people more than another. One's not more special than the other. There's nothing you do, have done, or ever could do that could change God's love for you. And he proved that by taking the bullet so that he could be just. And he is just. Like wrongs have to be paid for. Wrongs have to be righted to set things right. But he was willing to pay that price for us so that we can walk with him and become the people he created us to be.
Well, thank you for doing it.
Thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure. And once again, John, it's a real honor to have you here. So
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
I hope to meet you again.
Same. God bless.
Today's show is sponsored by HelixSleep.com. Sleep, especially as you get older, is so critical, especially that deep, comforting sleep. Go to HelixSleep.com and take the sleep quiz. I took it and was matched with the Midnight Lux. Helix knows that everyone's unique, so they have several different mattress models to match based on your body type and sleep preferences. Once you match, your mattress comes right to your front door, shipped for free. When you receive your Helix mattress, you'll be hooked. It's so easy to unbox and you won't believe how well you sleep. You'll wake up feeling rested and refreshed. Helix mattresses are fiberglass free and cradle your body for essential support in every sleeping position. They have a 10-year warranty, and Helix even has financing options and flexible payment plans. So a great night's sleep is never far away. Helix is offering up to 30% off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners. Go to helixsleep.com/SRS. That's helixsleep.com/SRS. This is their best offer yet, and it's not going to last long. With Helix, better sleep starts now. No matter where you're watching Sean Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.